All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, Ashik, for that great music. Welcome to week 2 of the Labor and the Job Guarantee series, sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York City office. I'm Carrie Thompson. I am Director of Education and Director of International Strategies for a union, UE, United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America. Last week, we started this series with a dive into questions about what is a jobs guarantee. We heard from economist Fidel Kaboub about what this kind of program and legislation would look like. Joining him were Sandy Darity of Duke University and Sydney Gazarian from the DSA Eco-Socialists. Together, they introduced how this big idea can address many problems in US society, from assisting to a transition from a fossil fuel economy to a green one, to addressing structural inequalities that result from entrenched racism and patriarchy that have devalued the work of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color and women. If you missed last week's session and have questions about the policy framework of a job guarantee, I encourage you to watch last week's session on YouTube. I think my colleague Erin is going to put a link in the chat there. And thanks again to all those colleagues who participated in last week's section and really kicked us off on such a great start. And also thank you to Rosa Luxemburg for sponsoring this series. I closed last week's session by highlighting some of the challenges of bringing labor into this conversation, as the series title proclaims. Chief among them, what do we even mean by this word and what we're trying to do here? So this week, we're going to dive into those questions that I raised with leaders from organized labor, by which we mean unions. Some of these questions I raised included, what does it mean for jobs to be union jobs? What does it mean to create the conditions for workers to have an organization that amplifies their voices? What does a job guarantee do to improve the quality of life for working people? Maybe like guaranteed time off. And then getting to some of those how questions. How do we ensure that workers are the ones that profit from a job guarantee, not corporations? How do we push back against capitalists to get the things that we really need from an economy that works for everyone? You know, just easy questions. So we saw from the feedback coming in from the Q&A feature that many of you shared these same questions, particularly around how do we accomplish any of this. I think that you'll find that our labor guests today are practical folks who are interested in arriving at answers to these questions. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature again to submit questions to our panelists. And we're going to hear from them on a number of questions that have already been raised for the first half of our time or so today, and then we'll move into answering those questions that are coming in from you, our audience. I hope you'll take the time to join us next week as we are planning an interactive concluding session that will include input from our participants. It will also feature job guarantee proponent Derek Hamilton. And now I'm going to pass the moderation responsibilities for this week over to my colleague and fellow labor educator, Judy Ansel. Judy is based in Kansas City and is retired from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where she ran the labor education program for 29 years. Still an activist for labor, she produces the Heartland Labor Forum, a weekly show about and by labor, which you can find by going to kkfi.org, Kansas City's community radio station. She is also on the board of the Kansas City Jobs with Justice, where they just helped SEIU healthcare workers at 2 local hospitals win a contract after a long union busting site. So welcome, Judy. Thanks for being here with us, and take it away.
Thanks very much, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here with you all and with such a distinguished panel of advocates for labor. Before I start, though, I want to mention the fact that it's a National Day of Action for the PRO Act, the act which will return to labor the right to organize. And our first panelist is Sara Nelson, who has served as the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, AFL-CIO, since 2014. She's currently serving her second 4-year term as the president of her union, and today she represents 50,000 workers of Aviation's first responders. I love the way that that says they're the first responders in 20 different airlines. And I want to turn it over to you first, Sara, before I introduce our other panelists to talk about the PRO Act.
Sure. Thank you so much, Judy, for that warm welcome. And I'm very, very happy to be here talking about a job guarantee, but also it is so important to recognize that today is the National Day of Action for the PRO Act. We really have to understand how we're putting power into workers' hands in order to change our workplaces. And if we start in the workplaces, politics will follow. So what the PRO Act does is this will update the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, and it is going to do several things. And many of this has come to light for us as we have been watching the brave workers in Bessemer, Alabama, take on Amazon, one of the most powerful companies in the world. And as we're waiting for the result of their vote, now I will tell you that I think that they have already won because of the way that they have really created excitement around the idea that workers can stand up even what has been characterized as the greatest powers in the world. Although I want to make it very clear that working people have power, the corporate elite have money and control, but we have the power if we want to take it to balance that out and level the playing field. If the PRO Act had been in place, many of the things that Amazon has done during the course of this election, the captive audience meetings where they made all the workers come. Now I want to put this in perspective. If you don't touch a box within 8 seconds, you are in jeopardy of being disciplined at Amazon. That means if you go away too long for more than the 2 times that you're allowed to go to the bathroom during the day, you may be facing discipline or dismissal. However, Amazon had the ability to stop production, bring all the workers together, and conduct what they call captive audience meetings to talk about how bad the union is, why they don't want it, to try to get the workforce to believe that management is going to dismiss you or hold you in bad favor, possibly fire you if you are a union supporter. And so those meetings would be illegal. The intimidation conducted by the individual supervisors who then conducted one-on-one meetings, the retaliation and the threats that maybe the warehouse would shut down if they vote for the union, that would be against the law. And all of these things would be addressed right away. That's what the PRO Act would do. It would hold the company accountable right away, because what Amazon and many other companies do is they hope that the workers will become demoralized through the process, that there will be so much turnover, that if they can just get through that election and get workers not to vote for the union, that actually then the union drive will stop and people will lose interest. The other way that corporations hope to win is once the union is voted in, once workers go through all the hurdles that it takes, they will delay the process of getting a first contract. And half of the union elections that happen where workers are successful do not result in a first contract. So this would require an arbitration and mediation process in order to have first contracts in place within a year when those workers decide to form their union. This would also get rid of what we call right to work laws, right to work for less laws, which means that the unions don't have to spend all their time trying to just sign people up, and it weakens the power in those states where those right to work laws exist. Workers do make less and it's less safe on the job. So we want to get rid of that. But what I really love about the PRO Act is that it is restoring the full right to strike for working people. So it outlaws permanent replacement of strikers. It allows for secondary boycotts, which means that if there is a workplace down the road or a company that tries to create a scheme where they can create the work outside of the employment process, that other workers have the right to stand up and go on strike in support of those workers. And that increases our power as working people, bands us together, and allows us to fight for the kind of world that we want to see, stopping all of this inequality. The other key component that the PRO Act includes is a requirement that anyone who is working as an immigrant is treated with the same working rights as the person who is a citizen in the country or a permanent resident in the country. So all of these issues that undermine workers and our power would be addressed with the PRO Act. This doesn't cover the law, the Railway Labor Act that the people that I represent work under. But what it will do is it'll increase the narrative that workers should have rights, that we should have the right in the workplace, and that employers cannot interfere with our free and fair choice to join a union and to bargain for our wages, benefits, work rules, and safety conditions at work. And finally, I just want to note that what this ultimately does is it gets at the issue of discrimination and inequality, because in a union contract, men and women make the same amount. People of color make the same amount as white workers. And this is what we need really to increase worker power and get at this. So there's a National Day of Action. Find the number, call your senator, call your representatives, and tell them to pass the PRO Act now.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was a great rundown. I got to have you on my radio show. But you can also tweet. There's a Twitter storm going on. Go to the AFL-CIO's webpage and you'll find some graphics and some messages and tweet them out and get all your contacts to all the people who follow you to tweet as well and call your senators. I want to introduce the other distinguished members of our panel. First off, Keon Liberato is a railroad track maintainer and president and principal officer of the BMW ED IBT Local 3012. The BMWE is the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way. That's the folks who maintain the tracks so that we can travel safely by rail. They're affiliated with the Teamsters Union. Keon is also a member of the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. Welcome, Keon. And third, we have Carl Rosen. He's been a member of the United Electrical Workers since 1984 when he joined UE Local 190 in Chicago. He was hired at Kerr Glass Company. He worked at Kerr for 10 years as a maintenance electrician and served in various elected positions for the local. In 1994, Rosen was elected out of the shop to serve as the regional president, and he was elected to become the UE General President in 2019. I'd add that Rosen was at the head of the Chicago locals during the Republic Windows and Doors shutdown and plant occupation in 2008, which gained national recognition as a successful and very militant union fight back against corporate corruption in the midst of a financial crisis. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you, Judy. Glad to be here.
So let's get started. And I want to start by putting the proposal for a jobs guarantee in the context of the current crisis that we face, and ask each of you to think about what would have been different for the workers that you represent in your particular industries if we had had a jobs guarantee in March of 2020. Let's start with you, Carl. UE represents a wide variety of workers in both private and public sectors. Then we'll go to Keon and finally to Sara, who are both in different parts of the transportation industry. So Carl, take it away.
Thanks, Judy. So you're saying at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And this really cuts to the heart of who is our economy structured to help. And right now, the economy is structured to help people who have money make more money, and not to help working people. And this is why the pandemic got so bad in our country, because people were desperate to be able to still have income and weren't getting it sufficiently in any other means than going to work. We should have had a much greater shutdown and done it the way that a number of other countries did, where people continued to be paid. You didn't lose your job. You didn't lose your pay. It would have made a big difference. We had good numbers of members, fortunately not nearly as many as other unions, When you get into the hospitality industries, et cetera, which were just decimated. And Sara can talk, I'm sure, about the big fights there in the airlines. But we still had a good number of our members get laid off. It was good that we had the additional layoff benefits. But if there was a jobs guarantee where people knew that they were going to be able to continue to be able to work, that would have been absolutely critical to them, and they wouldn't have had to go to work out of fear and be put in extremely dangerous situations. You look at people in, say, meatpacking, who continue to show up to work every day, even though those, it was basically they were walking to their deaths for many of them, and it was just absolutely outrageous that we allowed major industries to get away with that sort of situation.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Keon, how about you in the railway industry?
Yeah, thanks. I think a lot of what Carl said jives with what I've seen as well. We've got a lot of members who, they make decent money when they're working. They work hard. They work as much overtime as possible just to make sure they can make all the ends meet. And when this pandemic hit, you had a lot of folks who the first question they asked was, well, if we have to go out of work, how are we going to pay our bills? So, so there's some jostling. We got a little bit of support from our particular carrier out here on the Northeast Corridor, but, across the nation, the different railroad carriers responded differently to the situation, with some of them giving some days off. I think one railroad maybe gave like 2 or 3 days or something like that off. But then after that, the question is how do you get paid? And so basically a lot of folks just kept coming into work because they didn't know, they felt like if they felt okay, even if they knew they weren't quite right, as long as they could work, they would come into work, and they would do things like, oh, I'll try to keep my distance. But if you work on a railroad tracks, there is no social distancing on a railroad track, right? You can't stay 6 feet away. And at that time, there wasn't a mask mandate, that was enforcing that. And even still, there's questions around whether we can get enough of our people, clear on this, on the importance of wearing a mask and things like that. So that just created a really big, I think, crisis situation for a lot of us. I don't know offhand the total numbers, but just on my railroad alone, we've had, well over 1,000 workers have either going out on quarantine at some point throughout this pandemic, at least once, some of them multiple times. And we've had a lot of folks who have been infected. We've had a relatively low number of fatalities as a result of the pandemic on our particular railroad, but across the nation, we've seen double digits as a result. So if we had a jobs guarantee, there wouldn't be a question about what steps to take. It's like, well, safety first, right? We'll stay, you stay home, you keep everybody and their families safe from the spread of this of the virus, and you don't have to worry about your job or your income. So that's one aspect to it. The other is, as ridership, especially me in passenger rail, as ridership has dropped, that's also meant that, the need for her workforce has decreased, right? So then there's this question of furloughs. Again, the job guarantee, folks would not be worried about what would happen to being able to pay their bills and whatnot. I mean, there is railroad retirement, but if you know anything about the railroad retirement system, the pay is very, 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 very low. It's about a quarter of what your normal base pay is. So you may have enough to pay one bill, maybe a mortgage, but eating is another question. So I think that's one way it's really affected us. I will say that on my railroad, the track workers, we didn't get hit as hard in terms of job loss, but throughout the other sectors of the rails, it was large portions. I think 20% of workforce had gotten hit. So there's a lot of people that are hurting as a result of that.
Okay, thanks very much, Keon. And finally, Sara, I know that your members were under the threat of layoff constantly. And so take it away.
Thank you so much. So first and foremost, the coronavirus experience obviously showed us very clearly all of the inadequacies in our society. And a jobs guarantee, this discussion right now is not a new discussion. This was at the very top of FDR's second Bill of Rights, or the Economic Bill of Rights, which included number one, a job. So the right to a job, an adequate wage, and decent living. So within that job, a definition of union rights and the ability to make sure those are good jobs. A decent home, medical care, economic protection during sickness, accident, old age, or unemployment. So there has to be paired with it those safety net programs as well that will actually work. Many of those safety net programs that we have in place today, we found during coronavirus, have been chipped away at so horribly that the people who needed it couldn't even access it. And finally, a good education. So when we were facing this crisis, we know very well what happens in a crisis when you don't have a plan as workers, when you don't get ahead of this. And I have to always turn to Mother Jones and what she said 100 years ago as she was fighting to end child labor. She said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, but the fact that they themselves are continually organizing shows their real beliefs. The capitalists want the most labor for the least money, and the laborers want the most money for the least labor. Workers produce the wealth and build the world's palaces, but they neither use the wealth nor dwell in the palaces. If you would only realize that you hold the whole solution to the problem in your own hands, you could settle the problem easily. If, for instance, instead of striking in small groups, every industry in America were to hold up, the capitalists would be obliged to yield to any and all demands, or the world could simply not go on. Now, I have to tell you that we use the spirit of what we experienced after 9/11 and that crisis. And we know that the capitalists never let a good crisis go to waste. They are always organizing for the next crisis to try to extract more from us. And what we have seen over the past 20 years is we have seen the destruction of pensions. In our industry, we saw 30 to 40% cut in pay. We saw productivity go through the roof. This has happened with American workers, where wages have stayed stagnant and productivity has gone high. And all of that value in our productivity, in our labor, has gone to the corporate elite. It has not gone to working people or the poor. And so that incredible inequality has grown larger. What we did at the beginning of coronavirus was we said, we've got to have a way to stabilize things as much as possible. And if you think about a jobs guarantee as an automatic stabilizer, that's one way to think about it. What we proposed in that moment is that the federal government would actually use the payroll systems that are already in place at the airlines and only give money that could go to pay for the pay and benefits of the workers. It kept us in our jobs, even though there was no work to do. And so it kept us getting a paycheck. It kept us connected to our healthcare, continued retirement or pension payments. We continued to pay taxes, which supported those state and local systems that meant that mass transit could continue, sanitation, investing in our schools and safe schools. We couldn't do that alone as aviation workers, but we didn't add to the problem. We continued to pay our Social Security taxes and keep that system afloat, and continued to pay into Medicare. So it took care of healthcare. It took care of our ability to pay our rents, continue to keep our cable bill on, which supported other jobs as well. Imagine if we had that job guarantee, even going into this process, you wouldn't have to fight for these kind of ideas. So what we did was flip on its head what normally happens, which is that the corporate elite class will take a crisis, and when everyone is desperate, seek to extract more from working people, seek to make more, seek to permanently reduce the value of those jobs. What we also said in the bill is that there could be no reduction to the hourly rate that people were making. And we set the narrative that this was not going to be a time of austerity. This was not going to be a time of concessions for working people, but that we were going to continue to maintain and actually push forward. Because what coronavirus also did was it showed the value of that frontline work, of that sanitation worker, of the mass transit worker, of the teacher, of the grocery worker, the people who many times when we go through our lives, we don't think about the value that they create in our everyday lives, but without whom during this time, we would not have been able to survive. So a jobs guarantee is really about recognizing that crucial work and the people who want to contribute to society. Now, what we also learned during this time was because we had an erratic president who wasn't addressing the pandemic, and we had a political party who was willing to feed into that and feed into the idea that wearing a mask or doing anything to address the virus or take continued action to have everyone through solidarity, stay at home so we can get the virus under control and then move forward with our economy and have in place ways to support people during that time, as Carl was talking about. Instead, what we had was a fight against that and a desire to just say, oh, just open up and everybody should just come back to work. And this continued push of if you just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you're going to be fine. Well, no, we have an economy that is built on the idea that there's an assumed rate of unemployment for people who want to work. If that is 5% at any given time, we are saying that 5% of our population is doomed to the idea that they are not good enough to have a job. When you set up that kind of system, you also are inviting discrimination into the workplace, because certain people are not going to get that job. And who is it that is most likely not going to get that job when we are not supporting the idea that anyone who wants to work should have that right? So we actually saw this play out because from October 1st until December 28th, we did have furloughs occur because the federal funding did not continue and the airlines were able to lay off. And so what did we also see happen during that time? Our AFA EAP line went through the roof, because people were dealing with depression. They were dealing with substance abuse. They were dealing with the stress and strain with their families and the strain that caused in their own relationships at home because they didn't know how to provide for their families, provide for each other. Really, we're dealing with the stress of people losing their health care and not being able to figure out how they were going to make ends meet and survive. And in other cases, there may have been the ability to go out and get another job, but there just was not. There were not enough jobs to go around. What we also experienced during this time is that if we had been able to continue to pay those workers, there was a need in our nursing homes for flight attendants who are first responders in the sky, who already have some of this medical training, to go in and actually help out because there were additional hands that were needed. You could no longer have the elderly in these homes come to communal dining, because that was dangerous in the era of coronavirus. So not only did you need to have more people working in these nursing homes, you needed more people who were able to do this work. And flight attendants could have very easily filled that work if we had a jobs guarantee that would support that and that idea behind it. So we experienced firsthand what happens when you actually have something that looks like a jobs guarantee and how much that supported our workforce. And now we're going to get through this process without the talk of austerity and cuts to our jobs, which, by the way, we had to fight very hard against. But because we were able to get this done, we were able to say that with clarity to these airlines, not this time. And we're going to. And I will tell you that we just negotiated a contract for flight attendants at Envoy Air. It's an American Eagle carrier. They did not experience layoffs because much of the flying was pushed to smaller aircraft. And we just negotiated a contract with improvements right away. They're getting a signing bonus. They're getting an increase to pay, and they'll have annual step-ups from here. We did that during this time because we used the power of our union to promote the idea that is sort of an underlying pinning of a jobs guarantee. And that kept the narrative from talking about putting the cost on labor, pushing the cost to the working people who are going to bear the brunt of a crisis. So that's our experience. And that's why, even more than ever, we support a jobs guarantee and a different way of viewing our economy.
Thanks, Sara. I think that Sarah's already answered this question, but I want to address it to both Keon and Carol. Representative Ayanna Pressley, who has introduced a jobs guarantee bill in the House, says that it would ensure everyone has access to a good job with dignified wages, safe working conditions, health care, and other benefits, including full worker rights and union protections. Presumably, the members of your unions already have most of those things. So how specifically do you think your members will benefit from the jobs guarantee? Let me take you first, Keon.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's a question of how the language of the legislation in the final product is worded, right? And I think it's really important that organized labor really play a critical part to actually writing that legislation. I know that there is the Presley legislation and whatnot, but we want to make sure that all of organized labor is involved in that process just to cover all the bases. And I would say, like, one of the things we're facing on the railroad is, one, we're experiencing what do you call it? Technology is basically taking a lot of our jobs. Is really devastating the railroad and pretty much all the different sectors. And I'll give you an example. When I first got hired on the railroad back in 2014, we had 35,000 members in our union nationally. And now we're down to, I think, 25,000 members, right? And part of that is work being contracted out. So this is kind of a plug for the we need a PRO-Act, but for the real labor side, I think, so that we be able to more aggressively organize workers in our sector. But the other part is this question about automation. And so I think what comes up is, well, if we're losing jobs for people who want to be able to work, could this legislation actually provide sort of a how would I say, not a cushion, but would it create opportunities for us to move workers who are no longer have those occupations as a result of the automation into socially useful jobs, right? And I feel like a jobs guarantee that has that language in there would actually create a lot of opportunities for a lot of people who need work as a result of the automation. I mean, there's also other issues on the rail side, such as like precision, what do we call it? Precision scheduled railroading, which is, basically it's an insane way of loading down more and more trains and making workers work longer hours. And there's a lot of safety concerns with that. And that also is cutting down on jobs as well. So I think job guarantee could also help take some of the pressure off of workers by providing, again, that space for people who need to have socially useful, good jobs and union jobs, right? I mean, but at the end of the day, I think there's also bigger questions too, which is that we're going to actually have to fight, again, to organize contractors. We're going to have to fight for safety policies and safety regulations to actually to deal with the way the technology is being used to generate greater profits at the expense of working people. So I think that's going to be very, very, very important going forward. I think there's some indirect ways, though, that the job guarantee works that will help us. And what I mean is this: during this pandemic, what we saw was a lot of our coworkers were trying to find ways to take off work without being penalized, and that was a challenge due to the rules of the job, because their spouses they had to work as well, and they had children who had to be taken care of, but the daycares were closing down or the schools were closed, so that put a lot of pressure on a lot of families. And that's another way that I could see a job guarantee really helping us down the road, right? Like, I mean, outside of the specific conditions of a pandemic, a lot of times people are just holding on by a thin thread and trying to juggle different things around, and, getting this family member to help out here, getting this person to cover this shift, to watch their children and whatnot. And the reality is we need people to be able to do, childcare. We need people to be able to help restore different elements of our planet as well. So I see that as very important, and I see that as indirect to our industry, though.
Okay, great. Carl, you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Boy, there's lots of ways the jobs guarantee would make a big difference for our members and for all working people. So we're a very diverse union at this point, including we have a lot of folks who work in the public sector and in the care economy. And I think just like Sara indicated that, how obvious it would have been to divert folks to help out in nursing homes. Most of our members in those areas are way overworked. We've got social workers with huge caseloads. There's no way that they can give everybody the assistance that they need. This is because, again, we have an economy organized to make money for the rich, not to provide decent jobs for working people and take care of the needs of society. If we did have a jobs guarantee, I would think a lot of those jobs would go into exactly those areas and be able to bring those caseloads down, be able to make working conditions a lot better for folks and for those people to be able to do their jobs better because they actually have the time for each case that they're working on. Over in the private sector, where we still have a lot of our historic base also, I think so first of all, you should not assume just because people are union members these days that they've got great wages and great benefits. The reality, especially if you're organizing now, who you're organizing are low-wage workers, and they need to be organized. But then it is a fight. You don't turn around from one day making $11 an hour to the next day you're making $28 an hour. That's a generational fight, and a lot of folks that we organize these days have no health insurance. No pension or retirement, none of those things. And it's a big fight to get each and every one of those. And a jobs guarantee would help a lot on that, not only because it kind of sets a minimum standard, which is really important, but also it takes away the job fear. And so this is the way that it's really of most help to working people in a lot of ways, is the ability for folks to organize. I mean, the PRO Act is damn important, all right? We want to see it passed. But the reality is the PRO Act isn't going to get passed unless workers are in motion. Nothing important in this country, whether it's Civil Rights Acts, whether it's the original labor law, right, from the 1930s, that happened after people were out protesting and disrupting the economy and everything else, not before, right? So we're going to have to be able to get to that level. And that means going back to what unions did to get the union movement started in the first place, and the modern labor movement in the 1930s with the CIO unions, a much more militant brand and democratic brand of unionism than we have now. We laid it out this past year. We did in our booklet, Them and Us Unionism, which is available free online. Maybe somebody will put it in the chat. I encourage people to look at it. The principles that are there are what we need all of the labor movement to be doing right now to raise the fuss that's needed to win the PRO Act, to win a jobs guarantee, to win all of the great social battles that we need to fight and win. We have to have the movement in the labor movement in the workplaces, and that's aggressive struggle. That's involving the rank and file, which you can't do without doing the political education of the rank and file, so they know which side they're on. Who's them and who's us, so you know who you're fighting and why you're fighting, and why you're not going to be just given the good stuff. It means a level of political independence, that you don't just give donations to one political party and think that's going to take care of everything for you. You've got to hold everybody's feet to the fire, and you've got to unite all workers, right? And that means, cutting across all racial and gender and religious lines and all of that, of course, but it also means going to those areas that aren't organized like organizing the South, which is one of obviously the exciting elements. A huge uphill fight in Bessemer, but glad that a fight is taking place. It's going to be a long-term battle, but those are all things, and international solidarity. I mean, those are our bedrock principles and have been for generations, and it's what I think we need to do. And if we can get that level of fight going, we can win a lot of these things. A jobs guarantee takes away the single greatest weapon that the employer has against workers, which is fear of job loss. If you go into an organizing drive, it's always about what are the workers' hopes of what they can win with a union versus their fear of what's going to happen to their job, of what the employer is going to do to them. And when you have the jobs guarantee, that job fear goes away. That's why it's been the official policy of the federal government, which is controlled, by the big banks and the corporations, at least that section of it, the Federal Reserve, et cetera. Their official policy has been to maintain a certain level of unemployment, just like Sara was talking about. It's to keep that fear there, that if you don't do what your employer tells you to do, and it's based in, this is my political education in UE, is that U.S. labor law is based on the master-serf relationship from Old English law, right? So when you understand that's what it is, so you gotta obey that master, or you're gonna be put off the turf altogether, and your family's gonna really suffer for it. So a jobs guarantee really gets away from that, and therefore is very important on every level for our members and all workers.
Okay, that's great. That's why I love UE. And if you guys have never read Labor's Untold Story, I really recommend it. It's a great history of labor, and especially emphasizing the importance of mass movements of people winning gains for American workers. I see that Keon has his hand raised, so you want to add something?
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that Carl mentioned these things. You know, I think about I'm thinking about like on the railroad, like just like everybody else, everybody's afraid of losing their job, right? Because that's your livelihood. And I'm thinking about what it would look like if folks had no fear whatsoever that they wouldn't be able to pay their bills and take care of their families, right? And I'm thinking about the kind of militancy that would show up on the railroad, the kind of solidarity and unity that can actually uh, uh, be built on the railroad. I'll be honest with you, it's hard because, and I know Sara knows, like under the Rail Labor Act, it's very, very difficult to legally, to legally exercise the right to strike. And I mean, the courts and the politicians use every tool they can to prevent that from happening. And without that tool, it really weakens our ability to argue for greater unity against the carrier, and also to exercise that power against employers who are attacking our other rail comrades out there, and union comrades in general. I mean, we do have the right to engage in sympathy strikes. That's one of the benefits of not.
Yes, we do, Keon. Yes, we do.
So, without that fear, could you imagine us being able to use that just to support other worker organizing and struggles? I mean, I think that is, and I think, Carl, I think you hit it when you said that the real issue isn't just the legal rights to organize, right? That the PRO Act will provide. I think it's very important. But if you take away that fear aspect, those captive audience meetings might not mean much, to a lot of workers who want to come together and get something better. The fear of, I'm going to take away your shut down this plant, that's gone. It's like, okay, well, you shut it down, I'll get a job over here, So, but yeah, that's all. I just wanted to.
No, that's great. That's great. Thanks. Another key element that's been mentioned a bunch in the debate around a jobs guarantee is the question of who will benefit the most. And Representative Ayanna Pressley, many others say that the jobs guarantee is really key in benefiting workers of color and in narrowing the wage gap that has grown so wide in our country. The graphic that was used to advertise this class is from the March on Jobs back in the 1960s, and one of their March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Sorry, and one of their key demands was for full employment or a jobs guarantee. So it's long been thought that a jobs guarantee is really going to benefit most workers at the bottom, workers who are marginalized, workers of color. So who wants to comment on that?
Well, Judy, what I will do is just say that, we all want to work for a Green New Deal. We have a coming crisis here. that if we are not putting demands forward right now, this crisis is going to overtake us, and the corporate elite class will squeeze us like they never have before, because it will literally be about whether we can breathe or not. So I'm really excited. Actually, I've got some breaking news here. That the United Mine Workers of America have scheduled a National Press Club event on Monday, April 19th, with Senator Joe Manchin to set out demands for a just transition in energy. This is a big deal, okay? Because this is about labor talking inside labor saying, listen, we got to talk about the issues of our time. This can't be, we're not going to let politicians define this. We're not going to let the corporate class define this. We can talk in our union halls, because this is the one place where it's not a self-selecting organization. The boss actually hires us. They decide who's in our unions. We organize the workers because we have a common cause in asking, as Carl says, which side are you on? But which side are you on is not about political party. It's about whether or not you're for everyone in the country and for equal rights, for civil rights, for basic human rights or not. And so I'm super excited, actually, that the mine workers now are going to take a lead here on saying what a just transition needs to look like, on putting forward demands. And they're bringing Joe Manchin to the conversation. This is a conversation that they're going to have about the fact that there needs to be a transition in energy. That's big news coming from the United Mine Workers with Joe Manchin at their side. And that has been because we're organizing. The people on this call are organizing. The people on this call are organizing about the fact that, we actually have power when we come together and we talk about solutions. I want to applaud Ayanna Pressley too, because what she did was she put forward a resolution that says we need a job guarantee. She did not put forward legislation. She did not say, I've got all the answers. She actually put this out on the table for all of us. Like Keon said, we got to get into this conversation. We have to define what this job guarantee looks like. As this is not the minimum standard. This is about making sure that working people can actually help define what those jobs look like too, and have power to bargain, because we're not just talking about federal jobs here. I think this is where some people get confused. This is really an automatic stabilizer. We're still talking about private industry jobs, but they're going to have to compete with the standard that the federal government is setting for those jobs. So it sets up a situation where workers can actually be more empowered to fight for more, because it raises expectations about what those jobs need to look like and what we get in return for our labor. And that will automatically create a more just and equal society. And that is what the March on Washington was about, a march for jobs and justice. And so, the civil rights, equity, that is at the heart of this. And a jobs guarantee also will help us go into underserved communities and recognize all the jobs that can be created there, the schools that need to be built, right? The music programs that need to be available for the kids and all the different ways that they can participate. My dad was a physical education teacher who never actually made it into physical education because the state was cutting budgets, because they were cutting taxes, and that was more important. And so he ended up selling lumber for the rest of his life, and he hated it, but he needed to support his family. So, we actually can create a system here where we are incentivized to identify what communities need jobs, and that will automatically create greater equality, create more opportunity for everyone in every community. And by setting certain standards in those jobs, we're also making sure that people cannot be discriminated against. During coronavirus, one last thing, who has borne the brunt of this virus? It has been women. It has been women because they have had to stay home and take care of the kids, not necessarily because they couldn't work or because there wasn't a job to be had, but because we didn't have a kind of society that actually makes it possible for everyone to participate in the job market. So a jobs guarantee addresses all of that. And it doesn't just come from a place of whether or not corporations can make more and more money and ship it to Wall Street.
Great, thanks. What a great vision you all have. It's really exciting. Everybody should be applauding. So who else wants to respond to the question about civil rights?
I'll jump in. There's no doubt. I mean, all you have to do is look at what happens every time the unemployment rate goes up a little. Overall, it goes up a huge amount for people of color, and 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 right now you can see that it's spiked again, especially for black folks right now, and so clearly a jobs guarantee will have that direct impact, right, of making sure those communities aren't so so badly off due to this. And I look back. I'm from Chicago. I saw it in my lifetime that hundreds of thousands of folks migrated from the South where there was nothing for them, and they came up here because of all the great factory jobs in Chicago. And they joined unions, and these were good jobs, and they were able to buy houses and have a half decent life. And then, through the 70s and the 80s, we had the deindustrialization. We encouraged all of these factories to move overseas. Basically, it was U.S. government policy virtually to do that. One could certainly argue that was the foreign policy of the U.S. of extending U.S. empire was to allow these, was to create the conditions for these factories to move away. And so you lost those steady jobs for literally hundreds of thousands of folks. And now we're surprised that there's poverty and crime and violence. I mean, we created it, folks, and we're going to have to invest to uncreate it. We need a Marshall Plan for our inner cities and also similarly for rural areas. I think that's great news out of West Virginia that dialogue is starting, because part of what we face here is making sure people understand these changes are coming, right? Just like they always have. Automation, everything that's happened over the years, these changes are coming. The question is, are we going to be part of the dialogue about how we can change things so that they can benefit working people? We should have had a shorter work week as soon as automation was happening on the level that it was. And that would have helped reduce the number of people who lost jobs do that, and it would have shared the wealth that was created by this additional productivity rather than having it all go to the top 1/10 of 1%. But I also want to make the point, we should not make the argument we need the jobs guarantee just because it will help alleviate some of the racial inequities in this country. That is an important reason, but we have to make sure folks understand it's going to help all working people. When the minimum wage goes up, when we raise the bottom, everybody else goes up. We understood that in the plant I worked for 10 years, that if we didn't raise the rate of the janitor, eventually all of us were going to get pushed down towards that rate, because the boss said, well, somebody can live on that. Yeah. Well, why don't the rest of you live on that, right? So you got to raise that bottom in order to help raise everybody else. And it also, again, takes away the job fear, which means organizing, which means everybody can really improve their situation.
Okay. Let's switch, because we don't have too much time left before we take questions. And I want to encourage people, if you have questions, put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. But I want to start to talk about how do we win this, and what labor's role is going to be in winning this. Of course, it's not the first time that we have been talking about full employment in this country. Sara mentioned FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. The Democratic Party had a full employment policy in their platform from 1944 to 1988. It was taken out in 1992 when the Clintonians took over the Democratic Party. But then it came back in 2016, thanks a lot to the work of Representative John Conyers from Michigan. And now Ayanna Pressley is taking up that fight. And so can you all talk specifically about how you see labor's and the labor movement's role in winning this thing? Who wants to start? Anybody in particular? Let's start with you, Keon.
Yeah, okay. I can. I think the basic word is struggle. There's no getting around that. We're going to have to do the hard work of organizing all of our members, all of our coworkers, And by organizing, I mean, we've got to educate, we've got to train people to organize and talk to other people and to lead these struggles. And we've got to take collective action on a consistent and escalating basis in order to get the things that we need. And I think we have to reframe the conversation as this is a struggle for the thing. This is a struggle for our lives. These are a struggle for the things that we need, not just for good things that, you know, will be nice to have kind of thing. I think labor has to not just be at the table, it has to lead. I mean, I'll be honest, like during the beginning of this pandemic, I was stunned by the silence of the national labor movement on what needed to be done to keep workers safe, to keep communities safe, and to take care of our financial, long-term economic health. You know what I mean? It was being written by the politicians as they went along, and they played around and they sacrificed a few 100,000 people here and there in order to like figure out how to keep the economy going for the rich. And we were silent. I mean, apart from, some sectors of our movement, which were vocal and have been consistent about this stuff, but the national labor movement was silent. And so on this issue, we can't just say, we'll sit down at the table and see what they're proposing and then figure out what we want to do about it. We've got to start writing we have to write the legislation, and we have to basically write it and struggle in the streets. I think that's what we've got to do if we want to do this. And I think another part of it has to be, we have to like get away from the idea that we think these politicians can actually govern for working people. They never have been interested in that. They haven't done a good job of that, and they won't do a good job of that. So we have to say that working people should actually govern. And I think that's the attitude or the mentality that we have to take when we're engaged in this struggle, when we're talking to our members and coworkers and folks in our broader community. And we've got to also organize outside of I do think we have to organize outside of the shop floor, and start to branch out into the broader working class communities. With so few of us that are, organized within the unions, we have to actually figure out some alternative methods of organizing to bring together the rest of the working class to get into this fight as well. So
yeah,
okay.
I agree with Keon. I think that there's that labor does need to lead on this, and we know how to do this. We know how to raise expectations. If you go into any work site, you'll find very quickly that the workers are actually far ahead of the union leaders. So this is actually not that hard. If we just go about the business of doing it. We have got to raise expectations, and we can do that by bringing people together and having these conversations. So we define the problem, we set our demands, we add the urgency to it, and we make clear what we're willing to do in order to get it done. And, we have an opportunity right now coming out of coronavirus, this shared experience that we're never going to have again in our entire lifetime. And so this is the time to really bring people together and do what we would do in any contract campaign. You get in there, you talk with the workforce, you find out what it is that they want to achieve. You put together your opening position with the company, and you increase the mobilization activities up to the point of taking a strike vote and getting ready to strike. And you know what those final strike issues are and what you're going to go out on strike over. And everyone has to come to agreement on that. And you build a kind of consensus around that, because people really have to decide what they're willing to do in order to get what they want. And if we're not driving that kind of conversation and bringing people together around this, we're never going to get that done. So one thing I would say, though, is that in terms of raising expectations, we really have to take people out of the national narrative of being focused around a national debt. And we need to really help people understand that they can raise expectations. So Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, is a must read. It's a must read for every union leader. We should be encouraging members to read it. We should be talking about it in our communications about how the corporate class and the corporate elite have kept us at odds with each other over this debt issue. This has been a major issue that has kept people apart and made people identify with certain political parties when they're arguing against themselves. We also need to read A Case for a Job Guarantee by Pavlina Cherneva. And, this is education that we have to have in a baseline for the conversation, because we can't have these conversations with working people without having them understand that there is a different solution here. There's a different way at looking at the world. And the way that we have been fed has been that we have to be in competition with each other, that there's only so much of the pie. But the fact of the matter is, we can actually, if we work together, we can bake more pies. And we can have more for everyone. So I think that, that baseline of understanding what's possible is critically important, because the people in these work sites, the people who don't have jobs, the struggling poor, they're ready to take on the fight. They just don't know that anyone is ready to organize them to do that together. And that's why the national labor movement needs to lead on this. But the excitement and the energy is there, because there's nothing to excite people like not being able to feed their family, not being able to afford a roof over their head, and not being able to take care of their loved ones. It's there. It's ready. We just have to harness it and help bring it together and help people see that there are solutions that we can define and demand.
I
Okay,
agree.
thanks. I just have to brag a sec, because both Stephanie and Pavlina are products of UMKC. They taught there, University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Thank you.
Carl.
Yeah, so if I can just add, I obviously agree with everything that Keon and Sara just said, but 2 points I'd make. Number one, the labor movement, as diminished as it is still the institution that's rooted in the working class, that has the most resources, that has the most ability to lead a fight if we can get the leaders to lead, right? And this has happened in pieces in the past. So there was actually something in the 1970s and 80s called the All Unions Committee for Shorter Work Week, which was trying to do exactly, what I talked about a little bit earlier of spread out the jobs that existed amongst more people. And it had, there weren't many in the way of national unions involved in it, although mine certainly was, but there were some good sized locals, like in the auto workers and some other places where there was some better leadership that got engaged in that. And they did some good work. We could look at something like that. And then somebody put in the chat already that those of us unions that came together to try to form a labor party, an independent voice for unions, for workers in the 90s, had as its number one plank a guaranteed job for all. And so, it's something that we can organize around and need to in the labor movement. And it's, goes back to what Keon said about where was the leadership a year ago when the pandemic was underway about, what was it that working people needed? Where was that leadership from the labor movement? So we need that, and we all need to work towards that. But the other thing we need to do is be organizing these fights in the workplaces, both because, it's the only way to win anything is to actually fight, but also because in the course of those fights, it's what makes unions really worthwhile to workers, I would argue, is because in the course of those fights, you learn who's on your side and who's not and what the real roadblocks are. And people will learn that, yes, they can get some stuff out of the boss through those fights, but they also have to change society. They have to change the rules of the economy. They have to change those things through who's elected into office and is making these decisions, and that they have to put the heat there if they're really going to make a difference, so that what they win at the workplace isn't just taken away from them there. You only learn those lessons if you're engaged in those fights. And so the most important thing unions need to be doing right now is doing the work with their membership in order to get them engaged in fights, starting at the workplace and then, as Keon said, taking it out beyond.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're going to move to Q&A at this point, and there's a bunch of questions and there's a bunch of things that have been pulled out of the chat as well. I want to start with a question from Nafis Hassan, who said advanced economies like the US have been stagnating over the last 50 years. With the rise of automation and manufacturing and heavy industries, more and more workers are pushed into low-wage service sector, while managerial positions are automated and the wealth accumulates at the top. How does the jobs guarantee address this problem with worker polarization? Anybody? That's a toughie.
No, it's not tough. Sara, you want to go first or?
No, you go ahead, girl.
Go ahead.
Look, it's not automation. It's not computerization that has resulted in the impoverishment of large sections of the working class. It's the fact that we've allowed the rules to be rewritten so that the power in this equation resides with the very elite, and they've just stolen the money from the rest of us. If you look at the chart, Sara was talking about productivity. You look at the chart of productivity and real wages from the 1940s through the 1960s, and you can see that every year they went up together. And that was the creation of the quote unquote American dream, which was obviously never for everybody, but it did make a big difference for a lot of folks, right? And most people got raised up to some extent with it because we got our fair share each year. Well, then the 70s came along and the corporate elite decided they wanted a higher rate of profit, and it started under Carter and then it continued with a vengeance with Reagan and virtually every president since. And we'll see where we end up with this administration. I'm a little hopeful, more hopeful now than I was a little while ago, that maybe we can change things a little bit. But it created a situation where the new jobs that were being created were, because they weren't unionized and because the rules have been rewritten so you couldn't unionize them, therefore they're all paying at poverty level. And that's why people have been diminished. It doesn't need to be that way. I mean, you go to Europe, service jobs are well paid. There's no reason they shouldn't be, right? Why is not every worker in a bank in this country, these wealthy institutions, unionized and making good money, instead of a lot of them, your typical tellers and backroom workers making, quite low levels of pay? There's no excuse for that in our economy. It's not because of automation. It's because of the power dynamic in this country, and we just have to take that back.
Okay. Anyone else want to address that, or should we just go on?
The only thing that I would add, I mean, because Carl hit it out of the park. The only thing that I would add is that, Carl talks about having aggressive struggle and having to have that all the time, and having people remember what it's like to struggle so that we understand which side we're on, and we're exercising that muscle, right? And one of the things that happened during that time and the decline of unions, so as wages stagnated and productivity went up, there was also an inverse of how dense we were in our union density in this country. And what really happened there in the middle of that was the firing of the air traffic controllers by President Reagan. And that set a tone that struggle is bad, that striking is bad, that taking on the bus is bad. And it supercharged this idea that that had been created, I think, for intended good purposes of labor peace, right? Mass strikes led to the National Labor Relations Act that was supposed to lead to an era of labor peace where management and unions could get along. And then, when that started to not work and workers started to push back, then we had the firing of the air traffic controllers, which set this narrative that any kind of struggle by the workers was bad and something that you should be ashamed of and something that you could even go to jail for. And so that really set a steady decline on the willingness to struggle. And it is only where unions have decided that they're going to fight back, where they're going to strike, where we have seen any gains. And that has started to reawaken in this country, starting with the struggle that Carl led at the warehouse there in Chicago, and then moving on with the core group who took over the Chicago Teachers Union that told us that actually striking can allow workers to win again. And that set off and inspired workers all over the country that it's possible to win. And then we had the strike wave in 2018 and the start of 2019. But that hit the skids in 2020 because of coronavirus, and because there wasn't that national leadership to say this is a moment when workers are going to demand even more because we are being sent into unsafe conditions, because we are being told that we have to continue to do 2 and 3 jobs in these unsafe conditions. So anyway, this is a moment for us to learn to struggle once again, and that is what is going to create the difference. And it's not robot. We don't have to be afraid of robots. Robots are going to make our lives more efficient, and we get to just share in that. That productivity should go to us. Those work weeks do need to be shorter. They should be 30-hour work weeks for the same amount of pay, same amount of benefits. That's what we can demand if we set the agenda.
Well, okay, and maybe you just got a leg up on this next question, which comes from Tal Frieden, who says, some people say that we don't need a jobs guarantee because if we had universal health care, housing, education, universal basic income, etc., people wouldn't need to work. Others say we should be abolishing work and not expanding the scope of the labor market. Why do we need a jobs guarantee instead of guaranteeing basic needs regardless of someone's ability or desire to work? Why shouldn't that be our demand?
Well, you know what? Yeah, it does fit nicely with the last question. So let me try to weave it together real quick. I'll start with this. I think for a very long time, the labor movement the leadership of the labor movement has operated under this idea that management has a right to manage, right? That the capitalists have a right to their profits, that the capitalists have a right to direct and control production, and we just need to get our fair piece, right? I don't hold that belief. I think that they don't have a right to manage, and that we need to actually, as workers, as the people who produce the wealth, we need to be thinking about how to democratically, and in a way that actually provides for the needs of our people, of our communities, of our country, the world, really. To provide our labor, to use our labor to provide for the things that people need, basically, right? And I think that, and that's different from needing to, generate things in order to make a paycheck, in order to produce wealth and profit for someone else, anyway, right? So I'll start with that, and I think that. I think we're a little bit away from where, getting us to a point where we're thinking that way. But I do see the jobs guarantee as a step in that direction, right? As a tool to helping us to get people to start thinking about their work as a means of contributing to the health and the well-being of our community, and of the world, right? As opposed to, you have a job in order to get a paycheck, in order to survive, and you've got to please like a corporate master or whatever like that. Instead, people say, well, I can go I think in the last week's event, folks were talking about you can plant these trees that we need to do because we desperately need to renew our environment, right? You can go build bridges because we need to be able to get around. You need a transit system because people should have it's a human right to be able to move back and forth and to see different parts of the world and all that kind of stuff in I guess an ecologically friendly way. So that said, I do think that I would agree with the person who asked the question that we do need to get, at some point, probably a long time from now, but at some point we need to get away from the idea of a labor market, right? I think Eugene Debs was the one that said that it's pretty barbaric to think about the idea that there's a labor market out there, right? However, the need to work, I think, is something different, right? We all need to do something to contribute to our collective survival and our collective thriving. So I don't think that the issue is whether or not we want to eliminate the idea that people should engage in some kind of socially productive kinds of activities or in responsibilities. I think we all like to do that in some capacities, but we're not really free to make conscious decisions about, at least most of us aren't as free to make conscious decisions about what that work is. And then two, I just think that we're all going to want to actually engage in that kind of productive activity. I think there's something very human about that, right? To want to do that. And we need to do it. You know what I mean? So we're all going to have some collective responsibility in doing this thing, even as we move into, after the revolution is over and we move into a post-capitalist society, right? So.
I'm going to just tell one funny story, sort of. So, we usually talk about people according to what they do, whether they were, throwing bags for a living, or putting track down, or selling goods and services, or working in a retail store. You talk about that, and people really identify with that. When I go to events in Washington all the time, the first thing people will say is, "What do you do?" Right? And so it's very much identified with who we are as individuals. And we often will take calls from people who lose their jobs, who will, the first thing out of their mouths won't be like, I can't pay for my home anymore, but what am I going to do? This is who I am. Like, they took this away from me, my identity, right? So I think that we have to recognize that people want to contribute in some way. But also, I went to this high dollar event one time. I was not an actual contributor. I was just invited. But I mean, it was like big money, okay, in this political event. And so I went there, and I was 8 months pregnant. And the people there kept asking me, when are you due? And I heard, what do you do? And so I kept saying, well, I'm a union leader. And they would look like, what? First of all, what's a union leader doing at this event? But they were asking, it was a very nice thing. They were asking me, when are you due? So being a mother is also a job, right? It's just how we define the work. And we have been so willing to define certain work as not having value than other work. So let's expand our idea of what work is and how we are compensating for those contributions to our society, because everyone is contributing. Everyone is contributing something. So I do think it's important that we are expanding our idea of what that means, because this gives people real value in their lives and who they are. And everyone wants to contribute in some way. And I think that we have to really celebrate that, and not be in a place where we think of work as something bad. We think of work as something bad because we've been exploited, and we have allowed the boss to exploit us. We're not going to allow that anymore. That's the point of the jobs guarantee.
Okay, well, I want to take us back to the practical, and I want to do it with two questions, which I'm going to fire at you at the same time. One is for Margana Festinger, who asks, what's the best thing we can do to advance a jobs guarantee if we aren't in a union and have very uncertain prospects of changing that in the foreseeable future? And then the second question is from Cole Silva, who said, besides the PRO Act, what do you see as potential intermediate goals on the way to achieving a federal jobs guarantee? So let's go back and talk about what people can do now and in the near future in order to get there. Anybody?
Okay, so let me I'm just gonna try to be really simple. The American Rescue Plan was an immediate need to address coronavirus. It has ideas in it, though, that should be expanded. People actually got to experience that. It's very difficult to talk about policy in an academic way and have people actually relate to it. But people experienced the help that the American Rescue Plan gave them. That should raise expectations for what we are expecting now in the infrastructure plan. Right? And we should be demanding more. So in each of these bills, we should be demanding more and more, and we should be getting closer to that jobs guarantee. We should be getting closer to the demand for raising expectations on those jobs. Within the infrastructure package that Biden introduced is the PRO Act. Okay. Now, are we ultimately going to see that survive at the end of this process? Maybe not, but we should be using every moment right now to talk about why it is necessary and use these opportunities to raise expectations of the American public about what we can expect from our government and what kind of policy we should be seeing coming out. And every time we raise the standards there and get a little foot in the door of each of these components of jobs guarantee or the PRO Act or anything else that is giving working people power, the more that people have, the more likely they're going to fight for more. So this idea that if people have nothing means that they're going to have nothing to lose and so they'll fight for something else. No, they're going to have very low expectations about what they achieve. We should be recognizing that every step forward makes the next step possible, and we should be arguing for as much as possible in each of these times, and then really call out and hold up the stories of people who are benefiting from what they are receiving. So we should be holding up the examples of what's happening with the American Rescue Plan. When I went to Bessemer and talked to those workers organizing in Alabama, every single one of them had received their stimulus check that day, and many of them were for family households. And so they were standing up taller saying, we're gonna actually have something good to eat tonight. There is something serious about like really valuing people and putting in their hands the ability to care for their families that allows them to stand a little taller and expect a little more. So I just think that we can't lose what's happening along the way here. We have to really recognize that, celebrate it, and use it to stand up taller and expect more.
Okay, Carl?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Of course, I would add from a practical point of view for folks who aren't connected into a union right now or some sort of worker organization, there's lots of fights out there. There's lots of coalitions out there. Go find them, go get involved. Maybe there's a Jobs with Justice chapter in your area. Maybe there's a worker center in your area. Maybe there's a labor education program in your area. There's going to be something where you can help support workers in struggle, inspire workers. At a national level, I'd encourage people to check out the EWOC, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is a joint project of UE and DSA that grew out of the pandemic. And all of these workers in thousands of workplaces all across the country who realized that nobody was looking out for their health and safety, for their very lives when the pandemic hit. And they needed support, and they didn't have access to a union. And we put a toolbox out there to help them start organizing. I see it's been put in the chat, so people should go look at that. They're always looking for volunteers, or maybe one of the people who asked the question is in a workplace where maybe you don't have a union right now, but that doesn't mean you can't organize. That doesn't mean you can't fight back. That doesn't mean you can't get your fellow workers into the kind of struggles where they learn which side they're on and what it's going to take to change things, because we've got to get a lot more people in struggle before we can expect to win the kind of changes that we need.
Okay, great. And Keon?
Yeah, I mean, just to build off of what's already been said, I mean, what I'm thinking about in terms of basic steps is, one is starting to have the conversation with people in your community. So having those conversations, beginning to pull people together to educate about what's actually possible. So like, part of, I think, raising expectations is actually expanding the imagination. And I think this moment, a lot of the basic assumptions about what's possible and what should be done are really in flux, right? Like we have people that are getting stimulus checks, and some of these folks are people who said that they don't think people should get welfare, right? And well, now you're getting welfare. So, it's like, I think it's time to start educating and helping people to make connections between, okay, well, we're in this crazy, crazy situation. Millions and millions of people are out of work. Folks don't have healthcare. Folks aren't getting a paycheck, right? And now you're getting this temporary kind of stimulus, which is welfare. You're getting some welfare. And now the question is, well, in a situation where people are deeply in need, we provide, right? That's what we did in this particular crisis. So why wouldn't we say that, for folks who want to have a job, folks who want to be able to contribute to society in this particular way, how come they aren't guaranteed some work at a good wage? Two, we also saw that, in the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, they pulled like $2 or $3 trillion out of their ass just to give to Wall Street. I mean, I never saw both the Democratic Party and Republican Party so quickly agree on, like, I think it was within 24 hours, give all this money to big money, to big Wall Street, to big finance. And so if they can do that, and if they can just come up with money out of nowhere right now because they have to stabilize the economy right now, then they can come up with that money to guarantee that people make a good wage, do and have benefits doing the job, doing those jobs that are guaranteed by the government as well. So
I want to add on just one thing to that, to what Keon said, is that last March, the last item on the table was actually the relief for the airlines. And we had a negotiations outside of the political process with the corporations about what kind of relief that was going to look like. And so we had enough power. I told the corporations, you're not going to get anything unless you work with us. People hate you. You're going to have to work with us or it's over. And so it was actually labor bringing capital to the table, which is what happens in the political process. So when you start in the workplace, politics will follow. We brought capital to the table so that we had enough power to get bipartisan support, even under a Trump and McConnell regime, to say that this relief could only go to the workers, no cuts to our pay, and we put a cap on executive pay and banned stock buybacks. We did all that under a Trump and McConnell leadership. And thank goodness we had the House and we had Nancy Pelosi on our side, but it was because labor muscled that out with capital to say this is the way it's going to go. And so that really is the difference. So if we organize in the millions, that is what is going to change the difference in Washington, not because we change politicians, but because we change the power, even with capital.
Okay, well, thank you so much to our panelists, Keon, Carl, and Sara. This has been really illuminating, and I really appreciate it, and inspiring. I'm going to turn it back over to Ashik Siddiq to close us out. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to all these fantastic panelists for laying out some of the really important outlines of the conversations that need to keep happening to figure out how a jobs guarantee can build the world we actually want in the United States and beyond. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashik Siddiq. I'm an organizer with Democratic Socialists of America's Green New Deal campaign. And just to wrap up the conversation we had today and bring it back to the conversation we had last week and segue to next week's, I just want to zoom out a bit and put all this discussion into context of the climate crisis. To frame all of this, something really unprecedented happened during the coronavirus pandemic over the past year, which is that whole sectors of fossil fueled industrial activity were shut down worldwide. Some global estimates have found that this shutdown triggered a greenhouse gas emissions drop of 5 to 6% over the past year, which is the largest ever annual fall in carbon emissions in human history, more than during World War II or any previous economic crisis. And as stark as that is, it's actually still much less than what scientists say is needed to limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That would take as much as 15% emissions drops per year over the next 2 to 3 decades to reach net zero emissions worldwide. And as you might guess from the past year, under capitalist conditions, an economic decline that big would be catastrophic for many people, even worse than what happened to so many workers in the past year. And that should really make clear that the vast human suffering caused by economic crises like these is not a climate solution. This past year shows that quick decarbonization is possible and life can continue for many people, but it's not enough and it's absolutely the wrong way. It's disaster capitalism, as many of our speakers have laid out today. We need planning to make sure that economic transformations actually work for most people on the planet, instead of just allowing even more profiteering by the capitalist class, while so many people are immiserated. And a lot is being, so trillions of dollars have already been committed to economic recovery over the past year, and many more trillions are being discussed now in President Biden's climate and infrastructure plan. But if these plans are short-sighted, they could fail to curb carbon emissions. They could not really meaningfully resolve a lot of these crises of unemployment and underemployment that are being discussed, and they could actually make life fail to make life better for a lot of workers, and in some ways could make conditions worse for workers in many sectors. So if we want to really reshape the physical infrastructure of this country and create as many jobs as are needed, we need to do a lot more than what's on the table right now. And the past year, in many ways, has been a wake-up call for people to consider how living differently can be much better for people. This crisis revealed what kinds of work are really essential and what kinds of production and consumption really are necessary to keep society going. So there's still a big opening that hasn't been taken advantage of as much as it could be yet, but it can really help workers consider what policies we need to work, produce, and consume sustainably with workers' labor fairly valued. If an economic recovery happens the right way in the years ahead, every job lost because of COVID and the aftermath can be replaced by one that repairs instead of depleting our labor power and the natural world. So we heard a lot about the kinds of jobs that a jobs guarantee could value. And there are a lot of important threads that our excellent panelists have laid out today and last week. And these panels are meant to just be an entry point for organizers and policymakers to keep considering. A lot of these questions can't just be resolved in panels and policy papers. They can only be resolved through political struggle. So there are a lot of big questions that have been raised, and our panelists have pointed toward answers to them, but they need to keep being discussed. And that's really the point of next week's session, which will take the format of breakout sessions that'll be facilitated in smaller groups with participants drawing out a lot of the links from today and last week in order to help us build toward a common understanding of what a labor-centered jobs guarantee could look like and what it would take to make it a reality. So we hope you come back next Thursday at the same time for these conversations. We especially want to invite union members to participate because these conversations have to be shaped by workers who are often not part of discussions like these. So if you know anyone who might be interested, please pass along the links to watch the first two sessions, today's and last week's, and please invite them to attend the next one next Thursday. These sessions are all open to the public. They're being live streamed on the YouTube channel of Rosa Lux NYC, and we hope you come back next time. Thank you, everyone.